Sheftel here, and today we're going to talk about drones. Really, really scary mass drones that are invading the skies and about to fly over your cities, your fields, your homes, everything. Not quite, but we are going to talk about drones, in particular drone maker DJI, Chinese drone maker DJI, and what happened with it in 2019, why it got hit with bans, what might be going on under the surface, and then what to expect. So first, what is or who is DJI? So DJI is it's the dominant consumer drone manufacturer in the world, and people may also know it for various sort of cameras and gimbals and other things it makes, because a lot of what it does, a lot of what these drones are used for is consumer photography. So all the stuff that helps stabilize images and stabilize the drones and everything else is all part of its wheelhouse. And this company was started in 2006, and it's based in Shenzhen, which is a major Chinese city in the Pearl River Delta in southern China. And DJI has almost 15,000 employees and over a dozen offices around the world. So it's a really big company. And key thing to know is that it owns basically 70% of the consumer drone market, or at least it did in 2020, and there's not really any reason to expect that to have changed. So DJI is another one of these super successful Chinese electronics companies, or tech companies in general, hardware tech companies. And all of these are getting a lot of scrutiny because tech is a major sort of competitive arena for the United States and China. And also, other reasons we'll get into, but Huawei, ZTE, Lenovo, and other AI companies, all of these are getting serious scrutiny from the US government in particular. And DJI is kind of different because it is a consumer electronics. It's a consumer electronics company more so than Huawei or ZTE, which even though they had phones and stuff and they're moving into the consumer space, they are not quite as well. Actually, Huawei kind of was. It had its phone business in particular, but ZTE and those really weren't. But DJI is really a major consumer electronics company, and that's really important. Like I said, the drones that it makes are mainly these small drones for photography and personal consumer use, but they're also these really cool quadcopter drones, which kind of have cool stability features, and they're kind of like helicopters in different ways. It's actually very cool. But to the US government, all of this, DJI, consumer drones, a Chinese company with 70% market share in a growing sort of technologically frontier, potentially sector, that has always seemed pretty dangerous. And one part of this is that, as always, the U.S. government is worried about data collection, right? And so since 2016, 2017, the government has voiced on and off concerns about U.S. government, military, and civilian use of these drones. And most of this didn't really lead anywhere. Yeah, there's certain things that can be brought back to China, and there's obviously all sorts of uses and footage and all sorts of stuff that could have back ends and all that kind of stuff. But that really isn't the main reason why the United States has been so upset with these Chinese drones. The real reason is about technology and less about data and more about technology. And it gets down to the idea of consumer innovation cycles and how those are different from, or better than, or worse than a lot of these military technology cycles. And what we're really talking about here is that we now have consumer drones. For a long time, there were big military drones, right? The US has been using those in the Middle East for decades at this point. But there's something very different that happens when you are suddenly a consumer technology. And so what you often see is that consumer technologies go through these cycles, these really rapid cycles of iteration and improvement. A great example being Apple iPhones, right? Every year they get better in various ways. Obviously, it's sort of diminishing returns because if you're a consumer, at some point you're just like, well, I don't need a better camera. I'm not going to pay $1,000 for it. But this is more of a concern for the U.S. military, where the U.S. military kind of needs these sorts of innovation cycles itself. That's actually one of the big problems in military, large militaries, especially like the U.S. military, where the first Predator drone, the sort of first major military combat drone, it flew in the late 90s, okay? And there have been maybe 2 or 3 successor generations to this drone, not including various ones that are sort of in a black ops world. But the problem in general is that these military aircraft, you can call them aircraft at this point, these military drones, or whatever you want to call them, they do not see quick cycles of innovation, of sort of small but sufficient product runs, and then feedback, and then improvement. It doesn't move rapidly. It moves instead by a really inferior process that uses sort of procurement and requirement cycles and stuff like that the military sort of writes down and takes many years to go through it and test it and vet it and confirm it and do all that. And it's much slower. So you're getting the consumer market to answer a lot of questions about technologies and utilities and features and all this stuff that is much quicker than you get in the military. And that matters because drones are a big deal in the military, right? They're used in all sorts of, used in many areas, and they're being used in increasingly numerous ways in the military. So small personal drones, they can be scaled up to large military drones. And not even that, drones are also used at a small tactical level for platoons and small units in various parts of militaries around the world. And that really matters because these small consumer drones that DJI makes are actually a lot better in a lot of ways than a lot of the military ones. So a lot of the smaller military ones are kind of being ditched because they're more expensive and they're actually totally inferior to a lot of cheap consumer drones that have really been pioneered by DJI, right? So you're actually getting these actual consumer technological innovation cycles are actually manifesting and impacting the military, because we have, well, some guy in the military, some captain can have his own private consumer drone at home that can be better than the supposedly more advanced and more rugged and more this, more that military drones that he's using in service. And so that's one thing. And just to get, it's kind of wordy, but the key thing here is that the repeated iterations in a consumer uptake cycle for a new good or service, they're faster and they're more efficient, and they're often way better at scoping out new needs than the military-based sort of procurement process that has been used, God knows, since the 1950s or something. It's pretty awful, it's pretty antiquated, and it's pretty old, and the military knows it needs to change that, but has no capacity to actually do that, to make any significant change. So it's kind of just muddling along. And when it sees things like, how quickly iPhones improved when the military, but people don't remember, like 2011, 2012, you had these giant, terrible sort of basically screen-based interaction tools for various sort of military technologies and communication stuff. It was really hilarious. If you go back and you even look at some of the old military ideals of what the networked warfare would be in 2008, 2009, you look back and you're like, oh my God, they totally missed the fact that there would be a huge surge in all these, and increase in use, utility, and function, and miniaturization of all these consumer electronics due to the iPhone, due to those consumer electronic sort of improvement cycles. And it almost looks hilarious. And that's one of the big reasons the military actually really struggles to improve itself and does these massive multi-billion-dollar projects, and they're always slow. They tend to be out of date by the time they arrive, and it ends up having to do the whole thing again a couple of years later because it just has a process that is just way too slow. And it is what it is. But when you see something when you hear something like DJI having highly automated and pretty sophisticated assembly lines to mass manufacture drones in southern China, and that it makes the machine tools and software for these assembly lines in-house, that's kind of a worrisome thing, because high volume drone production lines kind of sounds like a military use, right? At least that is something the military would definitely think. And people also got to remember, when a company makes its own machine tools, software too, but machine tools historically, this is a sign that you're actually trying to do something at a much bigger scale, right? It's much easier to just make a really expensive prototype and not really design it for mass production, not really improve or consider the mass production process while you're doing it, right? And this is a big deal, right? So this is a big deal. It's also related to the aerospace sector in general, which tends to be basically the primary U.S. technological area. This is actually, most U.S. manufactured exports are planes, right? A lot of Boeing planes. And this has always been an area where the United States has been ahead of other countries. And the military in particular has relied on stealth technology, all these other things to maintain its decisive technological lead and military superiority against all sorts of countries, right? And so you start seeing how random small Chinese, not small anymore, it's a massive company, right? But random new Chinese drone makers, consumer electronics companies are really muscling in on some of these areas. It's very frightening to the U.S. military. And again, this is the deeper reason why we're even seeing a lot of these problems with DJI. Yeah, there's this drone stuff. I mean, there's just taking the drone data, right? Photography data, but most of this doesn't matter. And again, the stuff that really matters to have footaged is secret stuff, right? There's already satellites all around the planet that are taking pictures of everything every second of the day, right? And so this is actually an area where it's actually very interesting how useful are drones in comparison to satellites. You probably need both. You probably, in a military context, you'd be using multiple layers of sort of imaging and sensing and communication technologies, both in the atmosphere at various levels and in space, also at various levels once you're in supposedly space, right? That is something that really will matter. It's just going to be part of the way things happen. And right now, you can ignore, and I can't ignore, but all these, let's talk about the data and stuff. This is a concern with everything China does because it is creating a massive database of everyone in the world. I have a video about that. You should check it out. But the bigger thing is that the U.S. government is just trying to limit DJI's growth. And that's why in 2021, it got hit with investment bans, right? It got put on the entity list in the United States. So you can't deal with DJI in all sorts of ways. But this is a really toothless action because ultimately it could still sell all of these drones, right? Because there is actually no other option to DJI right now. And the ostensible reason for that actual ban was because the company was being used to monitor and surveil Uyghurs, which is definitely true. But most Chinese companies can be traced back to some use, especially most Chinese tech companies can be traced back to having some relationship to the whole Uyghur horror going on, right? So that's part of it, right? And that's always going to be brought up for everything. But the other deeper reason to keep in mind is, again, this connection between drones and increased drone, like really advanced drone technologies because you got to remember that not space conflict, that sounds like satellite conflict, but air superiority stuff, the stuff the Air Force deals with, tactical jets, all this stuff, drones are becoming an increasingly central role in this, and they'll probably take over a vast majority of the functions of typical tactical jets, manned bomber planes, surveillance platforms. All of this stuff is going to increasingly be unmanned or optionally manned. So this is going to become more and more important, right? And the idea that the United States is falling behind and it's relying on really old, stale government contractors to create platforms that might not just be at the same level. Again, I don't think this is actually true for a lot of reasons, but this is actually the strategic headwind that the United States feels like it is confronting with this, and that is what really matters in this. And this is just another one of the many areas where we have a moral purpose, the desire to protect or note or somehow deal with the Uyghur situation in China, but it's again intertwined with that same strategic purpose. And this is the way things go when you have a country that is so close to the United States in its sort of economic, political, military might, or at least it appears to be to many, many people, and to particularly the U.S. population, right? That is the way things go, and that's how the U.S. military and the government tends to respond. So the deeper goal, obviously, would be to have some sort of like the answer to some of this is to basically get some better American or Western companies that are in the consumer drone race. And there's a lot of companies that are appearing because they know this is a need, right? So you're actually getting a lot of companies that are spawning to do all sorts of things that it is clear that Chinese companies are going to be excluded from, right? Drone making is they're not going to exclude from, but there's a lot of companies that know, if we get into chips, if we get into drones, if we get into all sorts of things that Chinese companies have historically done or have gotten very good at doing, and we live in a world of increasing protectionism and nationalism, and they get slowly excluded or carved out, or there's non-tariff sort of borders or limitations, all this just put on these companies. Well, that's good, and a lot of people are already investing in American or Western companies that are going to basically take that business from the Chinese companies, right? The good example of this is just obviously the Huawei situation, where Ericsson and Nokia are just, they're coming out like bandits, but they're also unfortunately becoming limited companies. They're no longer quite global companies in the same way because they are almost inherently antagonistic to China, because they are the companies that are profiting from Chinese companies being forcibly limited in their global ambitions. And that is a story we're going to keep seeing for a while as this really just continues to play out. And this stuff kind of only matters if the consumer drone technology that we're talking about, like all these drones are so great, they're quadcopters, all this stuff's really awesome. It only matters if we actually continue to see these multi-year consistent and impressive improvements in the technologies, right? So it can't just stagnate at a 2020 quadcopter level. Then it doesn't really matter, right? Oh, well, if they were suddenly creating super sleek hypersonic consumer drones for like $500 or something, that would really matter. But if they just sit at the same technological level, it actually isn't that big a threat. But these days, the US government isn't really trying to do that kind of analysis, and also doesn't really have the capacity to do that kind of analysis. It's more be consolidated or broken apart and all that kind of stuff. That is more of what happens, and it's kind of not in the wheelhouse of the U.S. government to kind of make these sorts of decisions. But in general, the same question is always there. It's like, are there going to be huge improvements, or is it going to stagnate, right? The great example is, again, the iPhone, where there's cool stuff that's happened in the iPhone, but it's basically just a better camera in the same phone. It's been like that for like 6 years or something. And Apple's really taken advantage of its pricing power, and it's really increased the amount of money. It's astonishingly, we're all paying more for iPhones, even though we feel like we're getting less, right? From the actual new hardware improvements, right? And that is sort of the key question for a lot of this. And there's also, like I was saying earlier, like, how does this relate to satellite technologies? Again, in the military context, are we going to use for satellite stuff? How are these drones used? Maybe you just need data protection stuff. Maybe you need requirements of even DJI that has to make certain things in the US. Because like I said in this other video about the auto industry in the United States, ownership and production can be very different, right? You can have a lot of companies that are German companies that are making cars, or Japanese companies that are making cars in the United States, and that is the core of the industrial system. And you could have something very different, very similar actually, in the drone space. The problem is China does not want any of this, right? It wants to be producing everything in China because that is the key original pillar of its development model, which it used exports to stimulate mass investment in the country, and it just kind of rode up the spiral of that continuing process when things were really going good and the gravy train was still rolling. But this is, again, drones matter, right? Drones are war articles, right? The government actually calls this sort of stuff like defense articles when they're regulating their sale, and the U.S. has controlled drone sales for a long time now, right? It hasn't been selling Predator drones and then Avenger drones and Reaper drones, all this stuff to any country that wants them. And this is the other side to this story, because there's DJI on the consumer side, but China is now really big on the global military drone market, right? It doesn't just do the low-end consumer stuff, right? That would be different. That's a common American conceit. It's like, well, we do the high-end stuff, China does the low-end stuff. We do the super high-end military, big, advanced, impressive drones. China just does these really small ones. It's like, well, not right now. China does all of them. And it's true that China's military drones in particular do have problems. The customers have returned them, and they're not the best, but it's making a lot of them. I mean, outside of, Israel and the United States and also increasing countries like Turkey are big on the drone market, but China has the largest and the widest and the most capable set of military drones, right? It's really trying to emulate the entire U.S. Inventory of drones, right? And so this is a very big deal for the U.S. military, obviously, because, for example, a country like Russia, which is the other country that the United States is singling out as the one it needs to basically kind of prepare itself to combat in a, near peer, peer conflict, great power competition, all that kind of stuff, all the big buzzwords that came out during the Trump administration and these new military plans that came out. And these are the ones, right? Russia and China. And of course, Russia is just in there to make it seem like we're not just focusing on China, but it's obviously just China. And drones are a great example of why this is the case, because Russia is just now starting to really use and produce its first drones. It's basically its equivalent of the Predator drone, which, like I said, came in like the late 90s, early 2000s. This just flew in its military operations in Syria in the late 2010s, right? This is almost brand new. Its first supposed sort of larger combat drone. This is still in development, and Russia's really just starting to get into this space, right? It's really interesting because Russia historically really dominates the non-US military aerospace market, right? And this is actually where China has really struggled, and because the way it worked is that China actually developed a lot of its own military aircraft based on Russian designs. It either bought them or bought the rights to them or just reverse engineered them. But its problem was it also had to use Russian engines on a lot of these planes for a very long time. It's only just now starting to have its own engines on these planes. And that meant that Russia could control or limit the sale of the Chinese versions of these Russian planes to all sorts of countries. So China has never really done well on the world military aircraft export market. Even though China loves exports, like I was just saying, it has never done well in this area. And that's a big reason. That Russian connection is a really big reason, among a few others. And that can really change now with the drones, right? Russia isn't in the drone space the same way China is, and almost certainly will never be as good in the drone space because Russia's industrial base is just corroding as we speak. And that is a big difference. So China is actually going and is already using drones to muscle into the military aircraft market in a really big way. And like I said, this matters to the US government because it worries maybe DJI is just the potential consumer drone company that is really, is more the consumer drone tail that is wagging the military aircraft dog, of the Chinese state, right? That's a really mixed metaphor, but it really gets the sense of what the US thinks. It just thinks, oh my God, all across every scale of quality and capacity and price, we're seeing massive improvement in the Chinese drone sector. And that is worrisome to the US government. And so we're going to continue to see all sorts of back and forth over this issue, even though in the end, as far as DJI goes, unless you have comparable, better, equivalent sort of companies in the United States or from the West, it's going to still be a DJI show in the drone sector. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, like it, subscribe it to the channel, hit notifications. You'll get more juicy droney content like this. And with that,